I invite you to continue to hold this piece of fabric. In the same way that Courtney said that sometimes our individual lives are so tightly woven together that nothing can really enter in. In the same way, sometimes our circles are so tightly woven together that we don't have space for the other to enter in. Sometimes our families are so tightly woven that others can't be integrated in. Our churches, so tightly woven that there's not space for other people. So our communities, our country, so tightly woven that others are not able to be woven into the fabric of God's story. I want us to take into consideration our own lives. It's easy to just put it in a systemic thought of our churches, our communities, our country, and think about it in a distance. But what about you? Who's at your house for your family barbecues? It's a question I often like to ask. How is your life being unwoven, untightened, loosened up so that you are prepared for the lives and the stories of other people to enter in? Like Elimelech, sometimes we also shirk our responsibility, right? We don't take responsibility for the resources, the relational, the spiritual resources that we have that we might be able to provide for others. Instead, we just say, you can glean. You can take what's left over. I'll leave some for you. Instead of actually inviting people in to participate and to be a part of our lives and our stories and allow them to impact us, knowing that we will be changed as we enter into relationship with one another. These communities that are so tightly woven, our lives that are so tightly woven, they need to be broken. They need to be torn apart. We need to be reminded of the grief that exists when we don't let that happen. Not just our grief, but God's grief. God laments when he looks down and he sees us so tightly woven in our circles that we miss seeing the people and the stories around us. So I invite you to hold this for a minute. And similar to what Marilyn was sharing is that sometimes there are long-standing histories that exist. Our country's got a little bit of history, amen? There are things that need to be forgiven. There are things that needed to be mended and healed and redempted, be redeemed by God's grace. But that only happens when we acknowledge that those things exist, that the brokenness of relationships exist, that there's power and dynamic that exists that needs to be broken so that others can be woven in. So I want you to spend some time in silence, and I want you to reflect on two things. One, the larger systemic ways that we are so tightly woven. And the second part is how in your life, in your circles, in your churches, in your communities, in your families, is it so tightly woven that others can't enter in? What needs to be torn open? There's this custom in the Jewish culture called Kriah. It's the rending of cloth, the rending of clothing during a time of grief and loss and sadness. What grief and loss and sadness are you holding as you think about your life being torn open for the sake of God's loom being widened to more stories and more lives? So spend some time thinking about those things. What is the loss and the pain, the grief that you feel? About one, that these things exist, these tight circles exist, but also as you think about letting go of those. We're going to spend some time in silence, and when you're ready, I invite you just to tear that cloth and to hold onto that cloth and to recognize that this is not just a sign of loss and grief, but this is also a sign of hope that as it's torn open, it's an opportunity for God's grace to enter in. But let us sit with that grief and those thoughts for a moment. And as you feel led, you can begin to tear those, and we'll just stay in silence together.